There is a powerful strategy that many people underestimate when dealing with a narcissistic ex, and that strategy is silence. Not arguing, not defending, not explaining, not chasing. Just silence. At first it may feel uncomfortable because you have been conditioned to react, to respond, to justify yourself. But the moment you choose silence, something begins to shift in the entire dynamic. Silence is not weakness. Silence is a form of authority. It is the moment you step out of the emotional battlefield, where the narcissist once controlled the rules. When you refuse to participate in their drama, manipulation, and psychological games, you change the power structure completely. What many people do not realize is that the longer you remain silent, the more psychological pressure builds on the narcissist. They rely heavily on reaction, attention, and emotional supply. Without it, their control mechanism begins to collapse. And when that collapse starts, several predictable things begin to happen. Today we are going to break this down in an educational way so you can understand exactly what happens when you stay silent with a narcissistic ex. When you understand the psychology of a narcissist, one of the most important things you will realize is that control is not always loud, aggressive, or obvious. Much of their control is emotional and invisible. It operates through reactions. It operates through attention. It operates through the emotional responses you give them. In other words, their power often comes from your engagement. Every conversation, every argument, every explanation you give becomes a doorway for them to step back into your emotional space. A narcissist studies these openings carefully. They learn what makes you react quickly, what makes you feel guilty, what makes you feel the need to defend yourself, and what makes you chase them for closure. These reactions become their tools. They become the levers through which they move your emotions. When you respond emotionally to a narcissist, you are unknowingly participating in the system that keeps them in control. Even if you believe you are standing up for yourself, if the conversation turns into emotional chaos, they are still gaining something valuable from it. That valuable thing is your attention and emotional energy. For a narcissist, attention is not just pleasant, it is necessary. It feeds their sense of importance. It reassures them that they still have influence over you. It confirms that they still occupy space in your mind. Whether the attention is positive or negative often does not matter. What matters is that they can still trigger a reaction. This is why arguments with narcissists often feel circular and exhausting. You may notice that the conversation never truly resolves anything. You may explain your feelings clearly, yet they twist the conversation. You may try to correct misunderstandings, yet the topic suddenly changes. You may attempt to bring peace, yet somehow the situation becomes even more dramatic. This is not accidental. When someone thrives on emotional reactions, resolution is not their goal. Emotional engagement is. Now consider what happens when silence enters the situation. Silence removes the reaction they expect. It removes the explanation they anticipate. It removes the emotional display they have become accustomed to triggering. Suddenly, the system that once worked so reliably begins to malfunction. When you do not respond, they cannot observe your emotions. When you do not explain yourself, they cannot twist your words. When you do not argue back, they cannot escalate the conflict. The entire structure that supported their emotional control begins to collapse. Imagine someone trying to play a game where the other player has quietly left the room. No matter how many moves they make, there is no response, no feedback, no opponent to manipulate. That is what silence does to the narcissistic dynamic. At first, they may assume the silence is temporary. They may believe you are simply taking time to calm down. They may expect that eventually you will return to the familiar pattern of reacting and engaging. But when the silence continues, the absence of your emotional energy becomes impossible to ignore. Without your reactions, they lose their primary measurement of influence. They cannot tell whether their words are affecting you. They cannot tell whether their strategies are working. They cannot tell whether they still occupy the same emotional position in your life. This uncertainty weakens the control they once felt confident about. For many people, silence feels uncomfortable because they have been conditioned to believe that every message deserves a reply, every accusation deserves a defense, and every misunderstanding must be corrected. But in the case of a narcissist, constant explanation often strengthens the very cycle you are trying to escape. Silence, however, disrupts that cycle. It communicates something powerful without saying a single word. It communicates that you are no longer available for emotional manipulation. It communicates that your peace matters more than proving a point. It communicates that your attention is no longer something they can easily access. Over time, this shift changes the entire balance of the relationship. The person who once controlled the emotional climate now faces a barrier they cannot easily break through. Their usual tactics stop producing results. Their attempts to provoke reactions begin to fail. The emotional door they once walked through freely is now closed. And when that door closes, something remarkable happens inside you as well. Your mind becomes quieter because you are no longer trapped in endless explanations. Your emotions become steadier because you are no longer reacting to constant provocation. Your sense of self begins to rebuild because your energy is no longer being drained by someone who depended on your reactions to maintain their power. What once felt like a complicated emotional battle becomes surprisingly simple. By refusing to provide the reactions that fueled their control, you gradually remove their influence from your life. Silence does not mean weakness. Silence is strategic. Silence is intentional. Silence is the moment you stop feeding a system that was never designed to benefit you. And when the narcissist realizes that their primary source of emotional control has disappeared, the dynamic they once relied on begins to unravel in ways they never expected. When you remain silent after separating from a narcissistic ex, one of the first psychological reactions that begins to develop inside them is confusion. Narcissistic individuals rely heavily on predictable reactions. They build their entire strategy around studying how you respond to their words, their behavior, and their manipulation. Over time, they learn what upsets you, what makes you chase them, what makes you defend yourself, and what keeps you emotionally connected to them. In their mind, the relationship becomes a system of buttons they can press whenever they want a certain response. But when you suddenly remove your voice from the equation, the system stops working. The patterns they studied begin to collapse. They reach out in ways that once guaranteed a reaction, yet nothing comes back. This is where confusion starts to grow, because the narcissist cannot easily interpret silence. They are used to noise, arguments, explanations, emotional responses, long messages, and defensive conversations. Those reactions gave them information. They told the narcissist exactly where they stood in your emotional world. Silence removes that information completely. Without feedback, the narcissist begins to question what is happening behind the scenes. They may start wondering whether you have moved on emotionally, whether you have replaced them, or whether you have simply stopped caring. For someone who is used to being the center of attention in your life, this uncertainty becomes deeply unsettling. At first, they may try small attempts to test your silence. These attempts can appear casual or harmless on the surface. They might send a short message, like a memory from the past or a simple greeting. The goal is not necessarily communication. The goal is to measure whether they can still provoke a reaction. If they receive a response, even a cold one, they immediately regain a sense of control because the emotional line between you and them is still active. But when silence continues, their confusion begins to intensify. A narcissist's mind is constantly calculating position and influence. They want to know where they stand in your emotional hierarchy. When you refuse to engage, they cannot determine whether they still occupy a powerful position or whether they have lost it completely. This uncertainty creates internal pressure because their identity depends heavily on feeling significant and influential in other people's lives. Silence disrupts that identity. Instead of feeling admired, feared, or emotionally important, they suddenly feel ignored. And being ignored is something many narcissistic personalities struggle to process. They are used to strong emotional responses, whether positive or negative. Even anger from you once served as proof that they mattered. But silence suggests something much more threatening to them: emotional detachment. When a narcissist senses that detachment might be forming, they often become more observant. They may start checking your social activity, asking mutual friends about you, or trying indirect ways to gather information about your life. This behavior is not always about missing you in a healthy sense. It is often about trying to understand how the power dynamic has shifted. They may begin replaying past interactions in their mind, attempting to identify the moment where they believe they lost influence. However, narcissistic personalities rarely interpret events in the same way emotionally healthy individuals do. Instead of reflecting on their own behavior honestly, they often assume something external must be responsible for your silence. They may convince themselves that someone else is influencing you. They may believe you are playing a strategic game with them. They may even assume you are intentionally trying to make them jealous or provoke them. What they struggle to accept is the simplest explanation: you chose peace. Because silence is not something they trained you to do. Throughout the relationship, many narcissists conditioned their partners to explain, defend, and respond. Silence was never part of the pattern they controlled. That is why it feels unpredictable to them. Unpredictability is uncomfortable for someone who thrives on emotional control. As the silence continues, the confusion begins to shift into a deeper form of psychological discomfort. They may start wondering if they underestimated your strength. They may question whether their previous tactics will ever work again. The person they once believed they understood suddenly becomes impossible to read. And when someone cannot read you, they cannot easily manipulate you. That is the true power behind silence. It removes the narcissist's ability to study your emotional reactions and adjust their behavior accordingly. It leaves them facing a blank wall where their strategies once worked, while they are trying to solve the mystery of your silence. Something important is happening on your side as well. Distance gives your mind time to recover clarity. Without constant emotional conflict, you begin to see the relationship from a new perspective. Patterns that once felt confusing begin to make sense. Situations that once made you doubt yourself become easier to understand. Meanwhile, the narcissist remains trapped in their confusion, trying to decode a silence that no longer belongs to them. And the longer that silence remains, the clearer the message becomes. Their old methods no longer reach you, and the control they once believed they had is no longer part of your life. One of the deepest realities about a narcissistic personality is that their sense of power is built on control. Control over conversations, control over emotions, control over narratives, and most importantly, control over how you see them. When you were in the relationship, the narcissist carefully maintained this control by keeping you engaged in constant emotional interaction. They would provoke reactions, create arguments, withdraw affection, then return with charm. All of these behaviors had one purpose: to keep you emotionally connected to them so they could continue influencing your thoughts and feelings. But the moment you choose silence, something begins to happen that the narcissist is not prepared for. Silence removes the predictable patterns they once relied on. In the past, they knew how to make you respond. They understood which words would upset you, which accusations would force you to defend yourself, and which emotional tactics would pull you back into the conversation. They had studied you long enough to know exactly which buttons to press. However, when you stay silent, those buttons stop working. At first, the narcissist does not immediately recognize what is happening. They assume your silence is temporary. They may believe you are simply taking time to cool down, or that you will eventually return to the familiar cycle of communication. Because of this assumption, they often attempt small tests to see if they can still reach you emotionally. They may send a casual message. They may appear in places where they know you might see them. They might even send indirect signals through mutual friends or social media. These are not random actions. They are attempts to measure whether their influence still exists. When those attempts fail and your silence continues, a deeper psychological reaction begins to develop within them. For a narcissist, the possibility of losing control over someone they once dominated is extremely threatening. Their identity depends heavily on feeling superior and influential in other people's lives. When that influence disappears, it creates a sense of instability inside them. This is where fear begins to emerge. It is not the kind of fear that is openly expressed. Narcissists rarely admit fear because their self-image is built on appearing confident and powerful. Instead, the fear shows itself through their behavior. They may become more persistent in trying to contact you. Their messages may become more emotional, more dramatic, or more urgent. Why does this happen? Because your silence introduces uncertainty, and uncertainty disrupts their psychological structure. A narcissist needs predictable emotional responses in order to maintain control. When they insult you, they expect you to react. When they accuse you, they expect you to defend yourself. When they withdraw affection, they expect you to chase them. These reactions confirm that their influence over you still exists. But when you stay silent, the system stops functioning. Imagine someone pressing a button that used to activate a machine, but suddenly the machine no longer responds. The more they press the button, the more confused they become. Eventually, they begin to question whether the machine is broken or whether they have lost the ability to control it. This is exactly what happens in the mind of a narcissist. When their former partner remains silent, they begin to realize something that deeply unsettles them. They may no longer have access to your emotional world. And that realization challenges the very foundation of their ego. Because narcissistic individuals often see people not as independent individuals, but as extensions of their own influence. When someone they once controlled suddenly becomes unreachable, it disrupts the illusion that they are always in charge. As this fear grows, their behavior may become more intense. They might attempt to regain control through different strategies. Sometimes they try charm and kindness, presenting themselves as changed or apologetic. Other times they may attempt guilt, reminding you of shared memories or responsibilities. In some cases, they may even try to provoke anger because anger still proves they can affect you. What they truly want is confirmation that they still matter to you emotionally. Your silence denies them that confirmation. And this is why silence is such a powerful boundary. It communicates something without saying a single word. It tells the narcissist that their old methods no longer work. It tells them that the access they once had to your mind and emotions has been permanently restricted. For someone who depended on that access to maintain their sense of importance, this realization is deeply unsettling. But there is another side to this situation that benefits you. While the narcissist is struggling with the fear of losing control, you are gaining clarity and stability. Your silence creates space for your mind to recover from the constant emotional pressure that once existed in the relationship. Without their influence constantly pulling you back into arguments and confusion, your thinking becomes clearer. You begin to see the relationship from a different perspective. You start recognizing patterns that once felt normal but were actually forms of manipulation. The emotional distance allows you to rebuild your sense of self without their interference. And the longer that silence continues, the more permanent that transformation becomes. What once felt like a painful separation gradually becomes a powerful declaration of independence. The silence that initially felt uncomfortable eventually becomes a shield protecting your peace. In the end, the narcissist's fear of losing control becomes the very thing that confirms your freedom. Because the moment they realize they cannot control you anymore is the moment you have truly reclaimed ownership of your emotional life. When a narcissist realizes that silence is not temporary but intentional, their behavior begins to shift in ways that many people do not expect. One of the most predictable reactions is an increase in manipulation attempts. This happens because manipulation is the primary tool narcissists use to regain control. When their usual methods stop working, they do not simply walk away. Instead, they escalate their efforts to provoke some kind of response from you. A narcissist thrives on emotional engagement. Whether that engagement is positive or negative does not matter as much as people think. Praise, anger, frustration, arguments, explanations, these are all forms of attention. As long as you are reacting, the narcissist feels connected to your emotional world. Your silence interrupts that connection. And when that interruption becomes prolonged, the narcissist begins to experience a loss of psychological influence. At first, their manipulation attempts may appear subtle. They might send casual messages that seem harmless on the surface. They might ask simple questions or make neutral comments, pretending that nothing ever happened. This is often a testing phase. They are trying to determine whether the emotional door is still open. If you respond, even briefly, it tells them that the connection is still accessible and that their influence has not fully disappeared. But if you continue to remain silent, the tactics often become more calculated. Another common approach is what many people experience as sudden kindness or emotional vulnerability. The narcissist may reach out with what appears to be sincere regret. They may apologize, admit mistakes, or express how much they miss you. For someone who once seemed incapable of humility, this sudden shift can be very confusing. It may look like growth or transformation. However, it is important to understand the psychology behind this behavior. When a narcissist feels they are losing control over someone, they will often adopt whatever emotional strategy they believe will reopen communication. If kindness did not exist before but suddenly appears only when you pull away, it is often less about genuine change and more about regaining access. If emotional appeals fail, the manipulation may take another direction. The narcissist may attempt to provoke you instead of comforting you. This can appear through indirect criticism, passive-aggressive comments, or subtle attempts to trigger your emotions. They might mention things they know once bothered you, bring up old conflicts, or present themselves publicly in ways designed to make you react. The purpose behind these behaviors is simple. They are trying to activate the emotional patterns that once kept you engaged. Narcissists spend a great deal of time studying the people they are involved with. They observe what makes you angry, what makes you defend yourself, and what makes you feel the need to explain. Over time, they build a psychological map of your emotional triggers. When silence disrupts their control, they often return to those triggers in an attempt to reactivate the connection. Sometimes the manipulation becomes even more indirect. Instead of contacting you directly, they may attempt to reach you through other people. Mutual friends, family members, or social circles can suddenly become channels through which messages are delivered. You might hear that they are talking about you, asking about you, or portraying themselves as misunderstood. This is not accidental. It is another method of re-entering your emotional space without confronting your silence directly. There are also situations where the narcissist begins to present themselves as the victim. They may describe the situation in a way that places blame entirely on you, suggesting that you abandoned them or treated them unfairly. This narrative serves two purposes. First, it protects their image in the eyes of others. Second, it increases the chance that you will feel the need to defend yourself or correct the story. But every time you react to defend your reputation, the cycle begins again. This is why silence can feel so powerful and at the same time so difficult to maintain. When manipulation intensifies, it creates emotional pressure. The narcissist is essentially increasing the volume of their behavior to see if something will finally break your silence. Yet something important is happening beneath the surface during this process. Each time you refuse to respond, you are weakening the behavioral patterns that once gave the narcissist influence over you. Their manipulative strategies depend on predictable reactions. Without those reactions, their methods lose effectiveness. Eventually, they begin to realize that the tools they relied on no longer produce results. And that realization can be deeply frustrating for someone who built their sense of control around emotional access to others. Your silence, therefore, becomes more than just the absence of communication. It becomes a boundary that cannot be negotiated, argued with, or manipulated. It communicates something stronger than words ever could. It tells the narcissist that their strategies no longer control your behavior. And once that message becomes clear, the entire dynamic between you begins to change. One of the most powerful things that begins to happen when you stay silent with a narcissistic ex is that their true character slowly begins to reveal itself without your involvement. During the relationship, much of what you saw was carefully managed behavior. Narcissistic individuals are often highly skilled at presenting a version of themselves that attracts admiration, sympathy, or authority. They know how to say the right words, display the right emotions, and create the impression that they are misunderstood, charming, or even morally superior. But this image depends heavily on one important factor: your participation in the emotional drama. When you are constantly responding, explaining, defending yourself, or reacting emotionally, the narcissist can use those reactions to control the narrative. They can twist your words, provoke your emotions, and then point to your reactions as proof that you are the problem. In this way, they maintain the illusion that they are the victim or the reasonable one. Your responses become tools they use to protect their image. However, silence disrupts this entire performance. When you remove yourself from the emotional stage, the narcissist can no longer rely on your reactions to maintain their mask. They are left alone with their own behavior, and without your responses to manipulate, their actions start to stand on their own. This is when people around them begin to notice patterns that were once hidden behind the chaos of arguments and emotional exchanges. At first, the narcissist may attempt to recreate the old environment. They may try to provoke you, criticize you indirectly, or send messages designed to pull you back into the cycle. The reason is simple: if they can make you react again, they can return to controlling the story. But when silence continues, their frustration begins to grow, and frustration often exposes the parts of their character they tried hardest to hide. Without your cooperation, their manipulation becomes more obvious. Their sudden shifts in attitude, their attempts to gain sympathy, or their efforts to provoke drama start to look strange and exaggerated to outside observers. People who once believed their narrative may begin to question it. They start to notice the inconsistency between the image the narcissist tries to present and the behavior they are now displaying. Silence creates space for clarity. In the absence of constant conflict, others are able to observe the narcissist without distraction. And what often becomes visible is a pattern of behavior that repeats itself regardless of who is involved. They may begin targeting new people for attention or validation. They may start telling exaggerated stories about what happened between you, hoping to regain sympathy or admiration. They may attempt to portray themselves as the injured party, even though you have not said a single word. But the longer you remain silent, the harder it becomes for them to support that story. You see, when someone truly believes they have been wronged, they usually seek resolution, not endless attention. But when someone is driven by the need to control perception, their actions often reveal that motive over time. The contradictions become more visible. The emotional intensity begins to look performative rather than sincere. And here is something important to understand. Silence does not expose the narcissist by attacking them. Silence exposes them by removing the shield they once used. When you stop defending yourself, they lose the ability to twist your words. When you stop arguing, they lose the opportunity to provoke you. When you stop explaining yourself, they lose the stage they once used to perform. What remains is simply their behavior. And behavior, when observed over time, tells the truth more clearly than any argument ever could. But the exposure that happens through silence is not only about how others see them, it is also about how you begin to see them. Distance allows you to reflect on the relationship with a clearer mind. The patterns that once felt confusing begin to make sense. You remember moments where their reactions seemed disproportionate, where their apologies felt temporary, where their affection seemed conditional. You start to recognize that many of the conflicts were not random misunderstandings. They were part of a repeating cycle designed to keep you emotionally engaged. And once that realization becomes clear, something inside you changes. You stop viewing the relationship through the lens of hope or confusion. Instead, you begin to see it through the lens of understanding. That understanding becomes a powerful form of freedom. Because once you clearly see someone's character, you no longer feel the need to debate it. You no longer feel the need to convince others. You no longer feel the need to explain your decision to step away. The truth becomes self-evident. This is why silence can be so transformative. It allows reality to reveal itself without interference. It removes the emotional fog that once surrounded the relationship. And over time, the person who once appeared powerful, mysterious, or intimidating begins to look exactly like what they truly are. Someone who depended heavily on control, attention, and emotional reaction to maintain their image. When those things are no longer available, the illusion cannot survive, and in that moment you realize something incredibly important. You did not need to expose them. All you needed to do was stop participating. One of the most powerful shifts that happens when you remain silent with a narcissistic ex is the gradual change in the balance of power. During the relationship, the narcissist carefully built a system where they appeared to hold the authority. They influenced your emotions, your reactions, your decisions, and sometimes even your perception of reality. This did not happen overnight. It was built slowly through manipulation, guilt, confusion, and emotional conditioning. Many people do not realize that narcissistic control is rarely about physical power. It is psychological power. It is the ability to influence how you think, how you feel, and how you respond. When someone controls your reactions, they indirectly control the relationship dynamic. And the narcissist understands this principle very well. In the past, whenever they provoked you, you responded. Whenever they ignored you, you felt compelled to reach out. Whenever they criticized you, you felt the need to defend yourself. Every one of those reactions reinforced their position of control. They learned that with the right words or the right behavior, they could move your emotions in any direction they wanted. But silence interrupts this entire pattern. When you stop responding, the narcissist loses their ability to steer your emotions. Suddenly, the familiar buttons they used to press no longer produce the same results. The arguments do not happen. The defensive explanations disappear. The emotional reactions that once confirmed their influence are no longer there. This is the moment when the balance begins to shift. At first, the narcissist may not immediately recognize what is happening. They might assume you are temporarily upset or simply taking time to calm down. But as the silence continues, they begin to notice something unusual. The person they once controlled emotionally is no longer predictable. Predictability is very important for manipulation. If someone knows exactly how you will react, they can easily plan their strategy. But when you become silent and emotionally unavailable, you become unpredictable. The narcissist can no longer read you the way they once did. This uncertainty slowly transfers power back into your hands. Power in relationships is often misunderstood. Many people think power means dominance, but real power is emotional independence. It is the ability to maintain your peace regardless of someone else's behavior. When you reach that point, the narcissist loses their strongest advantage. Silence becomes a form of authority. You are no longer asking for their attention. You are no longer trying to prove your worth. You are no longer participating in arguments designed to drain your energy. Instead, you are creating a space where their influence simply does not reach you anymore. And when that happens, the narcissist begins to feel something they rarely experience: loss of control. Control was the foundation of the relationship. It allowed them to maintain superiority, to dictate emotional direction, and to keep you engaged in their psychological games. Without that control, they feel unstable. They may attempt to regain that power in several ways. Sometimes they will try to provoke you because anger is still a reaction. If they can make you angry, they can still affect you. Other times they may try kindness, apologies, or sudden affection, hoping that emotional warmth will reopen the door of communication. But when silence continues, the message becomes very clear. You are no longer operating within the system they created. This is when a deeper transformation begins inside you. Because silence does not only change the narcissist's behavior, it also changes your internal mindset. The distance created by silence gives you the opportunity to observe the relationship more objectively. You begin to see patterns that were invisible before. You recognize how many conversations were actually manipulations. You realize how often your feelings were dismissed or twisted against you. You start to understand that many of the conflicts were never about solving problems, but about maintaining emotional dominance. This awareness strengthens your independence, and the stronger your independence becomes, the weaker the narcissist's influence grows. Eventually, a point arrives where their attempts no longer disturb your peace. You may hear about their actions, their words, or their attempts to reach you, but they no longer create emotional turbulence inside you. The psychological grip that once existed slowly dissolves. This is the true meaning of power returning to you. It is not about revenge. It is not about proving them wrong. It is about reclaiming your emotional stability and realizing that your peace does not depend on their behavior anymore. Silence teaches you something extremely valuable. You do not need to engage with every conflict that comes your way. You do not need to defend yourself against every accusation. You do not need to explain your worth to someone who refuses to see it. When you understand this, your presence changes, your energy changes, your boundaries become stronger, and the narcissist senses that change. They realize the person they once manipulated so easily is no longer accessible in the same way. The emotional doorway they once walked through freely is now closed. This is why silence is so powerful. It quietly dismantles the structure of manipulation that once existed. It restores your clarity, your confidence, and your control over your own emotional life. The moment you stop reacting, you stop participating in the game. And when you stop participating, the system that depended on your reactions begins to collapse. That collapse is the moment when the balance of power fully returns to you. When you distance yourself from a narcissistic ex and maintain silence, something gradual but powerful begins to happen inside you and within the dynamic that once controlled you. At first, it may not feel like strength. In fact, the early stages of silence can feel uncomfortable, even painful. Your mind may still replay conversations, memories, and unresolved emotions. You may feel the urge to explain yourself one more time, to correct the lies, or to make them finally understand the pain they caused. But the longer you remain silent, the more a slow transformation begins to take place. A narcissist's emotional hold does not disappear overnight. It weakens through distance, time, and the removal of emotional interaction. The connection you once had was not built solely on love or companionship. It was built on a psychological loop where your emotions were constantly being triggered. When someone repeatedly pushes your emotional buttons, making you feel guilty, confused, hopeful, rejected, and then hopeful again, they create a cycle that keeps your mind attached to them. The cycle becomes addictive because your brain keeps waiting for resolution. But silence interrupts that cycle. When you stop responding, stop explaining, and stop reacting, the emotional pattern that once kept you tied to them begins to break down. At first, your mind may resist this change because it has been trained to expect drama, tension, and emotional intensity. Silence can feel unfamiliar because your nervous system was used to chaos. However, as days turn into weeks and weeks turn into months, something begins to shift. Your mind slowly starts to detach from the constant emotional stimulation that the narcissist once created. The arguments fade. The need to defend yourself fades. The pressure to prove your worth fades. Instead, you begin to experience something many people forget exists after toxic relationships: mental clarity. Mental clarity is powerful because it allows you to see the relationship from a different perspective. When you were inside the relationship, everything felt urgent and emotional. Every disagreement felt like something that had to be solved immediately. Every accusation felt like something you had to defend yourself against. But distance changes perception. You begin to notice patterns that were once invisible. You remember how many times you tried to communicate honestly, only to be dismissed or blamed. You remember how often your concerns were turned back on you. You start to recognize that many of the problems you thought were your fault were actually part of a manipulation strategy designed to keep you emotionally unstable. And as this understanding grows, the emotional grip that the narcissist once had over your mind begins to loosen. You no longer feel the same urgency to reconnect. You no longer feel the same need to fix what was broken. The emotional intensity that once defined the relationship begins to fade, and in its place comes a sense of calm. This calm is unfamiliar at first, but it is also freeing, because for the first time in a long time, your emotional state is no longer being controlled by someone else's behavior. You are no longer waiting for their approval. You are no longer adjusting your personality to avoid their criticism. You are no longer walking on emotional landmines. Instead, you begin to rediscover who you were before the chaos entered your life. You start focusing on your own growth, your own goals, your own peace. You begin rebuilding parts of yourself that were slowly worn down by constant manipulation and emotional pressure. Your confidence slowly returns, not because someone validated you, but because you finally stepped away from a situation that was designed to drain you. And as this internal strength grows, the narcissist's influence becomes weaker and weaker. The memories that once felt overwhelming start to lose their emotional charge. The things they said about you begin to feel irrelevant. The need for closure slowly disappears because you begin to realize something important. Closure does not always come from the person who hurt you. Sometimes closure comes from understanding the pattern and choosing not to participate in it anymore. This is why silence is so powerful over time. It does not just affect the narcissist. It rebuilds you. Every day you maintain that silence, you are strengthening your independence. Every day you refuse to re-enter the emotional battlefield. You are proving to yourself that your peace matters more than their drama. And eventually something remarkable happens. The person who once occupied so much space in your mind becomes less significant. Their words lose their weight. Their opinions lose their authority. Their presence loses its emotional impact. They no longer have the power to disturb your inner world. That is when the emotional hold truly breaks. Not because they changed, not because they apologized, but because you finally stepped outside the system that once controlled your emotions and refused to step back into it. One of the greatest fears a narcissistic ex faces is something they will rarely admit openly, the fear of becoming irrelevant in your life. During the relationship, their entire sense of power depended on knowing they could reach you emotionally whenever they wanted. They believed that no matter what happened, whether there was conflict, distance, or even a breakup, you would eventually respond. You would explain, defend yourself, argue, or try to fix things. That expectation created a psychological safety net for them. It reassured them that they still occupied space in your mind. But the longer you stay silent, the more that safety net disappears. At first, your silence feels temporary to them. They assume you are simply taking time to cool down. In their mind, this is just another cycle of the relationship pattern they have seen before. Narcissistic individuals often rely on predictable emotional loops. They provoke, you react. They withdraw, you chase. They hurt you, and later you try to repair the situation. Because these cycles happened repeatedly in the past, they believe the same outcome will happen again. Your silence at the beginning seems like just another phase before the usual reconnection. But as time continues to pass without any reaction from you, a subtle but powerful shift begins inside their mind. The absence of your response creates a void they cannot easily interpret. They start questioning the assumptions they once felt certain about. When someone who used to respond emotionally suddenly becomes quiet and unreachable, the narcissist loses the psychological mirror they depended on. Narcissists rely heavily on other people's reactions to confirm their importance and influence. Without that mirror, they struggle to measure their impact. As weeks or months go by, the silence begins to send a message stronger than any words you could say. It communicates that you are no longer emotionally invested in the dynamic they once controlled. This is deeply unsettling for someone who built their sense of identity around being the center of attention in your emotional world. When they realize their attempts to trigger a reaction are failing, frustration begins to grow. This frustration can manifest in several ways. Sometimes they will try indirect approaches, such as reaching out casually, pretending nothing happened, or sending messages that appear harmless on the surface. The real purpose behind these actions is not reconciliation, it is verification. They want to see if they can still activate your emotions. If you respond even in anger, they receive confirmation that they still matter to you. However, when silence continues, something even more uncomfortable begins to emerge for them: doubt. Doubt about their influence, doubt about their importance in your life, doubt about whether they truly had the level of control they once believed they had. This is where the fear of irrelevance begins to take shape. For a narcissistic personality, irrelevance feels like a form of psychological defeat. Their ego depends on being significant in the lives of others. Whether that significance comes through admiration, conflict, or emotional drama does not always matter. What matters is that they are still affecting you. Silence removes that confirmation completely. Over time, they may begin to observe your life from a distance through social media, mutual acquaintances, or indirect information. When they notice that you are continuing your life without reacting to them, without mentioning them, and without being emotionally pulled back into the old dynamic, it creates a powerful realization. They are no longer the central figure in your story. This realization can be extremely uncomfortable because it challenges the illusion they once believed about their importance. They may have assumed that you would always think about them, always talk about them, or always carry emotional weight connected to them. But silence communicates the opposite. It shows that your focus has shifted. Your energy has moved forward. What makes this even more powerful is that silence does not require confrontation or explanation. You are not arguing with them. You are not trying to prove a point. You are simply living in a way that no longer revolves around their presence. That quiet shift in behavior carries a deeper psychological message than any argument ever could. Meanwhile, your silence is doing something equally important for you. As time passes without engaging in their emotional games, your mind begins to detach from the patterns that once kept you stuck. You start realizing that many of the conflicts that once consumed your thoughts were never about solving problems. They were about maintaining control and emotional chaos. The longer you remain silent, the more clarity you gain. And with that clarity comes a new sense of independence. Your emotional world becomes calmer. Your thinking becomes clearer. And your energy becomes focused on your own growth rather than their behavior. Eventually, the narcissist reaches a point where they recognize a difficult truth. The connection they once relied on to maintain influence is no longer active. You are not reacting, not chasing, and not participating in the cycle that once gave them access to your mind. And in that moment, they are forced to confront the one outcome they tried to avoid from the beginning, the realization that they are no longer relevant in your emotional life. Your silence has removed the stage they once performed on, and without that stage, their ability to control the narrative disappears. What remains is the quiet evidence that you have moved forward, not through confrontation, but through the powerful discipline of refusing to give your energy to someone who no longer deserves it.